Please, everybody, make sure that your phones are off.
Tuesday morning, I stood here and I told you that what this case was about was the short life and the horrible death of one precious little boy. By now, of course, you know who that is. It's J.D. Angeles, born June 25th, 2022. He died January 14th, 2024. The state, of course, has charged Trinity Poague with causing his death. She's charged in an indictment which contends that she committed several violations of the law, several huge crimes, beginning with cruelty to children, aggravated battery. From each of those felonies, there's a charge of felony murder. And then finally, there's a charge of malice murder. And when you get to the point where you're having to move from this, we have this fact, and we have this allegation. How do you get there? And there's really not. I mean, the judge is going to tell you what the law is, okay? But there's not really in the judge's instructions. Typically, there's not really a roadmap for how you get there. And so, what I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, is this. And again, I mean, you are free to decide the case however you choose to decide the case and by whatever process you choose. But I would suggest to you or submit to you that you might consider this process. And that is, you start with the facts that are beyond dispute. The things that you know that are established, where there's just not a realistic argument, where there's not a realistic dispute, where there's no controversy. Start there. And then the reason you start there is this, because you can resolve the disputed issues in the way that is most consistent with the facts that aren't in dispute. Okay, so if you know that 2 and 3, that these two things are true, and then you're trying to decide whether this third thing is true or not, you can take that third thing and view it through the lens of what you know, of what you've already established or what you've already decided is an indisputed or undisputed issue. Once you've determined what happened factually, then you can apply the law to the facts. And of course, Judge Sizemore is going to give you a long explanation of what the law is, and he's going to tell you something very much like this. It's something that says to the effect of, you are the judges of the facts and the law, that you determine the facts, and then you apply the law to the facts to determine the outcome of this case. So for this part of my argument, what I want to do is this, ladies and gentlemen, is focus on some facts that are absolutely, at this point, indisputable in this trial. There is an indisputable medical fact in this trial, and that is that the cause of this child's death was massive head trauma. There's no question about, did he die because he had an infection? Did he die because he lost his leg and bled to death? Did he die for any one of these other reasons that might cause someone to pass away? In this case, the unanimous opinion of the medical witnesses that you heard from, the physicians that you heard from. I'm not talking about Dr. Gamble now. I'm talking about the actual doctors, okay, who testified in trial. Okay, Michael Bussman, who's practiced medicine in this town for 30-something years. Jill Olin, who has practiced medicine in this town for 15 or 17 years. Dr. Anthony Clark, who has served as a medical examiner both in Georgia and Florida, for the last 30-something years, who's done 8,100 autopsies, who's testified in court as an expert witness hundreds of times as to the cause and manner of death. They all agree this child died from this wound. Now, there are other injuries, and we're going to talk about those later in my argument, okay? But for right now, well, I want you to focus on this one, and that is that it is an undisputed fact that this child died from head trauma. It's also undisputed that the trauma, or the cause of the trauma, is also undisputed. Dr. Clark says it was a tremendous impact to the back of the head. These are quotes I wrote down while I was listening to the testimony. He says it was a tremendous impact to the back of the head. Dr. Busman says it was a direct, high-impact blow. There's not a question as to whether or not or how you get this kind of head trauma. In other words, it's beyond controversy. You can't get this kind of head trauma from bumping your head on the door back here, or you can't get this kind of head trauma because you have weak bones. You can't get this kind of head trauma because you have some rare childhood disorder like Paget's disease or Alagille disease or whatever it was that was brought up. Okay, rare childhood disorders, bone diseases, all these other things. None of those things will cause the trauma that this child suffered. To get this kind of trauma, it is an undisputed fact that it must be a direct, high-impact blow. The time frame between the trauma and this child's death, this child's appearance at the emergency room and subsequent death, is also not reasonably in dispute in this case. Okay. None of these doctors who testified even allow for the possibility that this child's injuries were suffered the day before or the night before or even 3 or 4 or 5 hours before. They certainly weren't built up over time. It wasn't that he had a partial occipital and parietal skull fracture, with a massive hematoma at the back of his head and 3 or 4 other brain bleeds across his head, and that they just built up over some period of weeks. That's not what happened. The high-impact trauma that this child suffered would immediately, according to Dr. Busman, very quickly, 30 to 60 minutes at the most, result in essentially a full onset of symptoms. Dr. Olick said there is 0% chance of normal behavior from the time of impact forward. So what are the chances? I mean, I asked, what are the chances? What are the chances that this child could have sustained this blow and behaved normally for any period of time? And the answer was, there is a 0% chance of that. Dr. Clark makes it 3 for 3. The time frame that Dr. Clark establishes is this. He says that at a minimum, initial symptoms like drooling, staggering, vomiting would have appeared very quickly, within seconds to minutes after the impact. He said, in his mind, you probably would be in terms of the initial onset of symptoms. In his mind, it's probably more like seconds than minutes before the symptoms begin. Those facts have been established, ladies and gentlemen, by the evidence that you heard in this courtroom. Okay, you don't have to Google it. Okay, you don't have to have a discussion about what happened, when you were a child or when somebody else was a child or those kinds of things. You don't have to talk about, what what people in the medical community really think. Okay, we're not talking about vaccines or something where some people say, it's this, you should take them, and some people say you shouldn't and all that. We are talking about medical facts as to which there is no disagreement. That brings you to this point. The question for you to answer as a jury is this: who could have caused the trauma that killed this baby within the time frame that it had to have occurred? Okay? No telling in any number of things, any number of people, any number of circumstances, could certainly have caused severe trauma to this child at some point in time. But that's not really the question. The question is, who could have caused this trauma within the time frame that you have available? There's an answer to that question. From 8 o'clock p.m. Saturday night, when they were in Albany, Georgia, on January 13th, 2024, until about 12:30 Sunday afternoon, January 14th, okay, for that whole time period, there was only one person who was ever alone with this child. One. There was one person who was ever alone with him for any period of time during that 16 and a half hours. You know who that was? That person was Trinity Poague. Not only that, ladies and gentlemen, when you focus on this time period and you reduce it down to the time during the time frame that the doctors talked about, the time immediately prior to the onset of the symptoms, the answer becomes clearer. One person was alone with JD during the time immediately before his symptoms appeared. That one person was Trinity Poague. At 11:55 a.m. on Sunday, J.D. Angelus was a healthy little boy. By 12:30 p.m., he was in a literal death countdown. It wasn't a question anymore as to whether or not he might live. It wasn't a question anymore as to whether he could be saved. It wasn't a question anymore as to whether he would ever be able to grow up. By 12:30 p.m., at 12:30 p.m., he was dying. There were symptoms that appeared during this time frame that appeared when Julian Williams, Jay Williams, when he pulled up to the dorm and he got out of his car and he went inside to pick up that child. Actually went inside to put down the pizza and the drinks because he thought they were going to have lunch. But when he went in and he picked up that child, there were immediate symptoms that the child was suffering right then. The child was essentially unconscious. Okay? The testimony is that his head was limp, that he couldn't hold his head up, that his body was limp, that his head was bobbling around. He was nauseated. Before he got to the car, or as he was getting into the car, the child threw up all over his daddy. He was draining CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? The fluid that circles your brain, that encircles your brain, that helps protect you from impacts, that helps protect your brain from shock, from harm. Okay? That fluid, by the time he got to the hospital, was literally coming out of his nose and his mouth. It was no longer contained here where it's supposed to be. It was here because of the head injury he had suffered. He was in cardiac or respiratory, cardiac and respiratory arrest at that time. When he got to the hospital, he wasn't breathing and he didn't have a pulse. Those symptoms, when you go back to the time frame that the doctors established, those symptoms would have had the impact that caused them, the impact that caused those symptoms would have had to have occurred within minutes before the child presented at the hospital. During those 35 minutes that we're talking about, okay, these 35 minutes right here, 11:55 to 12:30, during those 35 minutes, one person and only one person was alone with that child. Trinity Poague. to think about some of this, ladies and gentlemen. You have a circumstance where you have two people in a room. We see this in cases that get presented. I mean, I guess prosecutors everywhere see it at some point or another. You have two people in a room. One of them ends up dead. There's a fight. One of them ends up dead. Okay? You would think that's an easy case, right? Like, you have two people, one's dead, now we know who did it. Okay? But those aren't typically easy cases. And the reason they're not easy cases is because the person who is alive says, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault. He attacked me. He threatened me. He did this. He did that. I was fighting for my life. Or he angered me so badly that I didn't really have a choice. I was overcome by the emotion of the moment, So, it should be voluntary manslaughter or something like that. Okay. So there's a myriad of issues that sort of layer on top of each other when you have two people in a room. Except in this circumstance, okay? Because the two people in the room during those 35 minutes were J.D. Angelus and the defendant. Those are the two people who were in there. There's not an argument that can potentially, possibly, in this universe or beyond, there's no argument that can be made that it was caused by the child, that the child, was aggressive, that the child was the initial aggressor, that the child, attacked her and she had to defend herself. Okay? So it makes the two people in a room situation, instead of it being a hard case anymore, it becomes an easy one. I'm about to wrap up here in just a moment. Sit down and turn over the podium to Mr. Gamble. But I want you to think about something, okay? As you listen to him nitpick the evidence, and you heard the examination, you heard opening statements, you heard the examination of various witnesses, and so you already know it's coming. But as you hear him nitpick the evidence, I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind. What do any of these things really have to do with the death of J.D. Angelus? Did poor parenting, missing baby doctor appointments, misusing a car seat, did those things kill this child? No. Those things didn't kill this child. Would testing some dirty diaper that came out of the dumpster or testing the vomit that was on Jay Williams' shirt and jacket, would testing those things, would interviewing some people in Colquitt 50 miles or 75 miles away from, now it's more than 50, right? They're like 75, 80 miles away from where this happened. We're going down to Colquitt and interviewing some people. Would that put somebody else in the room with Trinity Poague and the baby? Would that have put somebody else in a position to inflict this trauma? No. Those tests, those things, you're not going to get that. Did a bottle of rum or a dispute or a fight over social media passwords kill that child? No. What killed that child was, with beyond dispute, it was a massive, tremendous blow to the back of his head that cracked his skull from here to here. So, there's a smoke and mirror show coming, though. I promise you. There's a smoke and mirror show coming. And I was thinking about this in terms of how do you see through smoke? Okay, how do you clear the smoke? Right? Firemen, okay? There's a house on fire. Firemen go in and there's smoke everywhere. They have to get through. They have to navigate through. The smoke will kill them. I mean, if you just breathe it in, it'll kill you. If you just accept it, if you just let it be there, if you don't fight against the smoke, it'll kill you. So what they do is they put on goggles, and a face mask, with a breathing apparatus and a breathing tank so they can navigate their way through the smoke until it clears and they can get to whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. That question, ladies and gentlemen, that question is, that provides your goggles, okay? That provides your breathing apparatus for getting through and seeing through the smoke that's coming. That girl killed that little boy. She killed that little boy. She cracked his skull out of anger, out of malice. We'll talk about all that later. She killed that little boy. She's the only person who could possibly have done it in the time frame in which it had to have occurred. Don't let these other things that don't have anything to do with the answer to that question, who killed J.D. Angeles? Don't let these other things cloud your vision and fog your mind.